Chapter 29. Teaching Disrupted Again. While being a courtesan to the rich and the influential had advantages like clean beds and customers, usually, the profession itself remained the same, stroking men's egos with pleasure. Whatever Alam had been looking for when she had begun this journey, she had not found it, and still searched. She sat mulling over the nagging emptiness of her life. She had comfort, a measure of safety, plenty of nice things, but she lacked an elusive something. Maybe it was purpose, a powerful reason for being. Janice cared for her, almost like a father. Now she had Marie to look after. But what was the meaning of it all? One day just followed the next. There must be more. She heard a soft but insistent knock at her door. A client this early in the day would normally be unusual, but it was not. As a priest, he needed to be more circumspect than most. They had seen each other before, and she thought she knew what to expect. She was dreadfully wrong. In the middle of things, a flood of scribes and Pharisees suddenly poured into her bedroom. They seized her, gagged her, bound a robe about her, carried her from her house into a large mob of people. They dragged her along with them, barely allowing her to keep her feet. As she looked around, she saw many of her regular customers caught up in the malevolent passion of the moment. Fear rose in her throat, threatening to choke her. Her place of business lay near the temple, and the momentum of the crowd carried her in that direction. What could this mean? The roughness of her handling and the jostling of the crowd knocked off her gag and loosened her bonds, but fear held her tightly in place, and she could only weep. She could feel her tiny life swallowed up in the murderous rage of this crowd. Yeshua had come to the temple that morning, and a crowd gathered around him. He had taken his usual seat on the temple steps. Many of the crowd also sat, so he began to teach them, as he often did. Suddenly around the corner came a mob of people, led by the scribes and the Pharisees. They dragged a woman with them. They brought her to Yeshua, then thrust her forth to stand alone. She wept softly. Slowly, Yeshua stood to his feet. "Master," coming from their spokesman, it sounded like a thinly veiled taunt. This woman was taken in adultery, in the very act. Yeshua thought, and how did they accomplish that? Collusion? The spokesman continued with exaggerated deference. "In the law, Moses commands us to stone such a woman to death. But what do you think we should do?" He gripped a stone in his hand, ready to begin the gruesome spectacle, and said this to test Yeshua. Yeshua had made a mockery of the Pharisees, driving their money changers and animals out of the temple, defiantly saying he would rebuild the temple in 3 days. They intended to expose him as a fraud, but they needed some concrete evidence against him. With this woman, they saw their chance. The Pharisees knew Yeshua had escaped other verbal traps. But let's see him get out of this, the words screamed in the Pharisee's head. Yeshua looked at the crowd, then at the woman, then knelt and began to write something on the ground. He listened to his Father as he wrote, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength." As he did this, they continued to pester him for an answer. Finally he stood up and said quite calmly, "He who is without sin may cast the first stone." He knelt back down, listened some more, and slowly continued to write, "And you shall love your neighbor as yourself." The oldest of the Pharisees, even more revered than their spokesman, stepped forward, a rock in his hand. Alam saw it all through her tears. She knew what came next. She prepared herself as best she could. The Pharisee looked down at what Yeshua had written, the words Yeshua had said ringing in his ears. He hesitated, thinking, "Surely I should be the one to throw the first stone." He looked again at what Yeshua had written. Guilt engulfed his heart, remorse for what he himself had done. With the picture of his own sin emblazoned on his mind, he let the stone fall from his hand. Alam flinched at the sound of it striking the earth. The Pharisee turned, walked silently out of the courtyard, and left the temple. The eyes of the crowd followed him as he left. The spokesman stepped forward, fiercely grasping his stone, only to find his heart similarly gripped by the guilt of his own sin. He dropped his stone and left. Alam flinched again as it hit the ground. One by one, each of the others stepped forward to experience their own form of regret and let their stone join the Pharisees. After a while, Alam quit flinching as the stones clattered to the ground, hitting one another. Soon all the mob, even those he had been teaching, had gone, leaving him alone with the woman, who still braced herself for the impact of the first stone that would hit her. He stood up and stepped towards her and reached out to take her chin in his hand. Startled out of her fear, she looked into his eyes as he lifted her head. He dropped his hand. "Woman, where are your accusers? Does no one condemn you?" Why did he call her woman? She wondered. Surely even he had heard of Alam, the famous palace courtesan. He could have called her any of a number of other things. Perhaps he did not see her as just an object of man's desire, a toy to be used and cast aside. Perhaps he saw her as simply a woman, a lost, hurting woman. A spark of hope glimmered in her soul. She looked around while she dried her eyes on the sleeve of her robe. No one stood around her any longer. No one to condemn her. She stopped looking and dropped her head again. He remained. He could condemn her. He reached out, lifted her chin once again, and she looked into the eyes of the purest, most powerful love she could have possibly imagined. "Neither do I condemn you," he said. "Go and sin no more." The spark burst into a flame. Go and sin no more? Was that even possible? Could I really begin a new life from this moment on? As he let go of her chin and then brushed the back of his fingers against her cheek, he simply nodded, yes. She felt more power in that unsaid word than in all the armies of heaven. She turned to walk away, filled with a love and a purpose she had not dared to believe existed moments ago. The hope of a new possibility-filled future motivated her with a love beyond words. 50 steps away, she turned back to look at him. He still stood there, looking at her and smiling. The next time she turned around and looked, he had gone.